Imagine two people learning English. The first person sits in a classroom, endlessly repeating phrases. The cat is on the table. The cat is under the table. They memorize grammar rules, fill out worksheets, and take tests. After 1 year of real diligent study, they can explain the present perfect tense perfectly, but they freeze when ordering coffee. The second person never opens a grammar book. Instead, they watch TV shows they enjoy, read stories that fascinate them, and listen to podcasts about topics they love. After 1 year, they can't recite a single grammar rule, but they confidently chat with the barista about last night's basketball game. Which approach works better? The answer might surprise you, and it's backed by neuroscience. Today, we're going to explore what many linguists call the secret sauce of language learning. Comprehensible input, a revolutionary concept that's transforming how millions of people acquire new languages. My name is Harry, and I'm about to share with you why understanding this one principle could completely transform your language learning journey, whether you're just starting out or have been struggling for years. By the end of our time together, you'll understand why your brain is already perfectly wired for language acquisition, how the traditional methods many of us experience in school might have actually slowed us down, the fascinating neuroscience behind natural language learning, and, most importantly, how to apply these insights to accelerate your own progress starting today. This isn't just theory. I'll share real examples from learners across cultures who have experienced breakthroughs using these methods. So get comfortable, because we're about to dive into the secret sauce, why comprehensible input works for language learning. Let's start with a brief journey through history. For centuries, language education followed what we now call the grammar translation method. Students memorized vocabulary lists, studied conjugation tables, and translated sentences back and forth. Think Latin class in Victorian England or traditional foreign language classes that many of us experienced. In the mid-20th century, the audiolingual method gained popularity. Remember that scene from the movie Love Actually, where Colin Firth sits in a language lab repeating Portuguese phrases. That approach was based on the behaviorist idea that language learning is habit formation through repetition. But something was missing from these methods. Despite years of study, many students couldn't actually use the language in real situations. They knew about the language but couldn't communicate in it. Then, in the 1970s and 80s, a linguist named Stephen Krashen proposed something revolutionary. After extensive research, he suggested that we acquire languages not by studying them, but through a natural process similar to how children learn their first language, by receiving what he called comprehensible input. Krashen argued that the ideal language input is material that's just slightly beyond your current level, what he called I+1, where I is your current level, and +1 represents new elements that stretch your understanding just enough. But here's what made his ideas truly groundbreaking. Krashen distinguished between language learning and language acquisition. Learning is conscious, studying rules, memorizing vocabulary, practicing conjugations. Acquisition is subconscious, absorbing language naturally through meaningful exposure. According to Krashen, only acquisition leads to fluent, natural use of language. Think about your native language. Did you learn it by studying grammar rules? Of course not. You acquired it naturally by being immersed in meaningful communication. First understanding, then eventually speaking. But here's the first big question that might be forming in your mind. If acquisition is so natural, why do so many people struggle with language learning? That's the paradox that we're going to unravel today. The answer lies in understanding how your brain actually processes language, and it's probably not what you think. In the next section, we'll explore the fascinating neuroscience behind language acquisition and see why comprehensible input is so powerful. We'll also address the elephant in the room. If this approach works so well, why isn't everyone using it? But first, let me ask you, Have you ever had the experience of studying a language for years but still feeling uncertain when actually using it? Or conversely, have you ever found yourself understanding or speaking better after watching films or listening to music in that language? Share your experiences in the comments. I'd love to hear them. To understand why comprehensible input works so effectively, we need to look at what happens inside your brain when you encounter a new language. When you listen to or read something in a language you're learning, your brain doesn't process it the same way as, say, solving a math problem. Language processing activates multiple regions simultaneously, including Broca's area, Wernicke's area, and the temporal lobe, creating neural networks that strengthen with each exposure. Here's where it gets fascinating. When you receive comprehensible input, material you can mostly understand but with some new elements, your brain engages in what neuroscientists call prediction processing. It's constantly making predictions about meaning based on context, using what you already know to decipher what you don't. This predictive process is actually central to how your brain learns. Each time you successfully decode meaning from context, dopamine is released. Yes, the same feel-good neurotransmitter activated when you eat chocolate or receive a compliment. This creates a positive feedback loop that reinforces learning. But here's the critical insight. This process happens automatically when two conditions are met. First, the input must be comprehensible. You need to understand enough to follow along. Second, and this is what many traditional methods miss, it must be compelling. Your brain allocates attention resources based on interest and emotional engagement. When content is boring, your brain literally processes it differently. MRI studies show that engaging content activates more regions of the brain and creates stronger memory imprints. This explains why you might remember lyrics to a song in a foreign language but forget vocabulary you memorized for a test. Krashen called this the affective filter. When you're stressed, bored, or anxious, this filter goes up, blocking acquisition. When you're relaxed and engaged, the filter lowers, allowing language to flow in naturally. Now, here's where the traditional classroom often gets it wrong. When language is presented as a series of rules to memorize, it activates your analytical brain regions rather than your language acquisition network. You're learning about the language, not acquiring the language itself. This explains why many people can ace grammar tests but struggle with actual conversations. But this raises an important question. If grammar study isn't the most effective approach, how do we ensure we're using language correctly? The answer lies in your brain's remarkable pattern recognition abilities. When exposed to sufficient comprehensible input, your brain naturally extracts patterns and rules without you consciously analyzing them. Think about it. Children acquire complex grammar in their native language without studying rules. They don't learn that went is the past tense of go by memorizing irregular verb tables. They absorb these patterns naturally through repeated exposure in meaningful contexts. And here's the first big aha moment. Your adult brain still has this capacity for natural pattern recognition. You haven't lost it. In fact, as an adult, you have cognitive advantages that can accelerate acquisition when properly leveraged. But there's a catch. This natural acquisition process takes time and exposure. There are no shortcuts. The key difference between successful language learners and those who struggle often comes down to one simple metric: the quantity of comprehensible, compelling input they receive. This explains why immersion environments often accelerate learning, not because they force you to speak, but because they dramatically increase your exposure to comprehensible input. So let me ask you this. Given what we now know about how the brain processes language, which approach makes more sense? Studying abstract rules and memorizing vocabulary lists, or engaging with content you find interesting that's at the right level for your understanding? The science is clear, but there's more to the story. In our next section, we'll explore how to identify truly comprehensible input and how to create an optimal environment for acquisition, whether you're learning at home, in a classroom, or abroad. But first, let me pose a thought experiment. What if everything you thought you knew about language learning efficiency was backwards? What if struggling and making mistakes isn't actually the fastest path to fluency? The answer might surprise you. Before we continue, I'd like you to reflect on your own language learning journey. Think about a time when you made unexpected progress in a language. Maybe you suddenly understood a conversation you wouldn't have expected to, or found yourself using expressions you didn't realize you knew. Was it after A, intensive grammar study, B, memorizing vocabulary lists, C, consuming content you enjoyed, shows, our books, conversations, D, forced speaking practice? Interestingly, when we asked this question to thousands of successful language learners, over 70% selected option C, consuming enjoyable content. This brings us to a provocative question. What if most language education has been focusing on the wrong things? What if speaking too early, grammar drills, and vocabulary memorization aren't just inefficient, but might actually slow down your progress? In the next section, we'll explore this counterintuitive idea and see how the comprehensible input approach completely transforms the language learning journey. So what does a comprehensible input approach actually look like in practice? Let's follow 3 different learners applying these principles in different ways. Meet Maria, an intermediate English learner. Instead of forcing herself through grammar, workbooks, she's chosen a different path. Every morning she listens to a podcast called Comprehensible English that's designed specifically for her level. She understands about 80% of what's said, with the remaining 20% stretching her abilities. The podcast discusses topics she's genuinely interested in, from psychology to travel. And crucially, it doesn't oversimplify the language. It uses natural speech with strategic repetition of new vocabulary and structures. Each time Maria hears a new word or phrase in context, her brain forms tentative connections. As she encounters these same elements in different contexts throughout the episode, those connections strengthen. Without consciously studying, she's acquiring language patterns. Now meet Takeshi, a beginner who's learning English through stories. He uses graded readers, books specifically written for language learners of progressive levels. He started with simple stories he could understand about 90% of, gradually moving to more complex texts. The key is that Takeshi chooses stories he finds genuinely interesting. Mysteries, adventures, biographies of people he admires. He's not studying English. He's enjoying stories that happen to be in English. What's fascinating is that Takeshi never reviews vocabulary lists or grammar rules. Yet tests show his vocabulary growing by hundreds of words per month and his intuitive grasp of grammar improving steadily. Our third learner, Sophie, is advanced. She simply watches television shows she enjoys in a target language, starting with subtitles in the same language, then eventually without subtitles. She doesn't understand every word, but she follows the plot and characters. Sophie's emotional engagement with these stories actually amplifies the acquisition process. When she laughs at a joke or feels suspense during a tense scene, her brain releases chemicals that enhance memory formation and pattern recognition. Now contrast these approaches with a traditional classroom where students might learn 10-20 carefully selected vocabulary words per lesson, practice specific grammar patterns, and perhaps have brief, structured conversations. Research shows that students in comprehensible input environments can acquire 5 to 10 times more vocabulary over the same period. And more importantly, they can actually use it naturally in context. This brings us to another key insight from Krashen's research, the natural order hypothesis. Language features are acquired in a predictable order that doesn't necessarily match the sequence presented in textbooks. For example, in English, the ing present progressive form is typically acquired before the third person singular AA. He runs, she walks, regardless of which is taught first. Your brain has its own acquisition schedule, and comprehensible input respects this natural process. This doesn't mean grammar knowledge is useless. Krashen's monitor hypothesis suggests that conscious learning serves as a monitor or editor when you have time to review your output, like when writing. But the flowing natural language you need for conversation comes primarily from acquisition, not learning. Now you might be wondering, but what about speaking practice? Isn't that essential? Here's the second big aha moment. Speaking emerges naturally after sufficient comprehensible input. Children listen for months before speaking their first words. When learners attempt to speak before they've received enough input, they typically resort to translating from their native language, reinforcing unnatural patterns. Many learners report experiencing what linguist Elaine Tyrone called the din in the head. After substantial comprehensible input, they begin to hear the language playing in their mind, phrases and patterns bubbling up spontaneously. This is a sign that acquisition is occurring and that speaking ability is developing naturally. Our three learners, Maria, Takeshi, and Sophie, all find that their speaking ability develops organically as a result of their comprehensible input activities. When they do speak, they're not translating or assembling sentences from memorized rules. They're drawing on the patterns they've internalized through exposure. Another advantage of this approach is cultural awareness. Maria notices differences between British and American expressions. Takeshi picks up on cultural references in his reading. Sophie observes body language and social norms through her TV watching. This cultural context is often missing from textbook learning, but is essential for true communicative competence. This all might sound too good to be true. Learn a language by doing things you enjoy, which brings us to the question, if this approach is so effective, why isn't it more widely adopted? What are the challenges and limitations of comprehensible input? As we move into our next section, we'll address these crucial questions and reveal the unexpected barriers that have kept this approach from becoming mainstream, despite the compelling evidence supporting it. Here's a perspective shift that might change how you view language learning forever. The most effective language acquisition happens when you don't realize you're learning. Think about that for a moment. The traditional view positions language learning as work. Difficult, often tedious work. We expect it to feel challenging. We believe we need to suffer through vocabulary drills and grammar exercises to make progress. But neuroscience shows us something remarkable. When you're engaged in compelling content that you can mostly understand, your brain enters an optimal acquisition state. Time seems to fly by. You're focused on meaning, not form. And paradoxically, this is when your brain acquires language most efficiently. So why do traditional methods persist? The answer lies partly in our educational history. Modern school systems were designed during the Industrial Revolution to train factory workers, emphasizing discipline, rote learning, and measurable outcomes. Traditional language teaching fits neatly into this model. Grammar rules and vocabulary lists are easy to test. Progress feels tangible. You completed chapter 5. You memorized 20 words. You can conjugate these verbs. But actual language acquisition is messier. It's non-linear. It happens in spurts. And crucially, it's harder to measure in the short term, even though it produces far superior results in the long term. There are also powerful commercial interests at stake. The global language learning industry is worth billions. Textbooks, structured courses, and language apps with gamified vocabulary drills are easier to package and sell than facilitating natural acquisition through comprehensible input. Here's the revolutionary insight. What if the feeling of difficulty that we associate with effective learning is actually counterproductive when it comes to languages? What if enjoyment isn't just more pleasant, but actually more effective? Research increasingly suggests exactly this. Language acquired in enjoyable, low-stress context is retained better and accessed more fluently than language learned through conscious study and effort. As we move into our final section, we'll explore how to apply these insights practically, creating your own optimal comprehensible input environment regardless of your current level or resources. Now, let's get practical. How do you create an effective comprehensible input environment for yourself, regardless of which language you're learning or your current level? The key is finding the sweet spot where content is both comprehensible and compelling. Here's how to approach it systematically. First, honestly assess your current level. The ideal comprehensible input is material where you understand approximately 80-95%, enough to follow the general meaning, but with some new elements to acquire. A quick test. Can you follow the main ideas without using a dictionary? If yes, but you still encounter unfamiliar words and expressions, you're in the sweet spot. Next, identify topics that genuinely interest you. This isn't just about making learning more enjoyable, though that's important. Remember that compelling content creates the optimal brain state for acquisition. Are you passionate about cooking, sports, true crime, history, technology? Whatever captures your attention in your native language can become a vehicle for language acquisition. Now, find resources that match both your level and interests. Here's where the landscape has transformed dramatically in recent years. Graded readers designed specifically for learners at progressive levels. Podcasts with transcripts like our Comprehensible English series. YouTube channels creating content for language learners. Streaming services with subtitles in the target language, language learning communities where natives and learners share resources. The key is consistency and volume. Research suggests that the single biggest predictor of success is the total number of hours of comprehensible input you receive. This brings us to the fourth step, creating a sustainable routine. 10 minutes daily is more effective than 2 hours once a week. Small, consistent exposure creates the neural pathways that lead to acquisition. Look for ways to integrate comprehensible input into your existing routine. Listen while commuting, cooking, or exercising. Replace some of your native language entertainment with target language content. Small, consistent changes lead to remarkable results over time. The fifth step is perhaps the most challenging. Trust the process. Traditional education has conditioned us to expect visible progress, completing exercises, passing tests, moving through levels. Comprehensible input works differently. Like a seed germinating underground before breaking the surface, much of the acquisition process happens beneath your conscious awareness. There may be weeks where you don't feel like you're making progress, and then suddenly you notice you're understanding more, or expressions start coming to you naturally. Linguists call this the incubation phase, and it's a normal part of the acquisition process. Your brain is forming connections and patterns even when you don't consciously perceive it. As your comprehension improves, gradually increase the complexity of your input. This natural progression maintains the optimal I+1 balance. Many learners begin with content created specifically for language learners, then transition to authentic materials designed for native speakers. First with scaffolding like subtitles, then eventually without. Let's address some common challenges. If you find material too difficult, don't force yourself to continue. That creates frustration, raising the affective filter. Instead, seek simpler content or use scaffolding like transcripts or subtitles. If progress seems slow, remember that acquisition is non-linear. Keep a journal to track what you can understand now that was difficult before. These small wins accumulate over time. If you need to speak sooner for practical reasons, that's okay. Just recognize that speaking practice alone won't drive acquisition. Continue prioritizing comprehensible input alongside speaking opportunities. If you're concerned about accuracy, Remember that with sufficient input, your brain naturally identifies patterns and self-corrects over time. Focused attention during input, noticing how native speakers express certain ideas, accelerates this process. This approach works across cultures and age groups. In North America, the TPRS, teaching proficiency through reading and storytelling, method has shown remarkable results in school settings. In Europe, the extensive reading movement has transformed language education in many progressive schools. In Asia, where test performance is highly valued, comprehensible input approaches have been shown to improve test scores more effectively than traditional methods. As we move to our conclusion, let's synthesize these insights into a practical roadmap you can begin implementing today, regardless of your target language or current level. Let's bring everything together into a clear, actionable roadmap. Shift your mindset. Language acquisition happens naturally when the conditions are right. Your job is to create those conditions, not to force memorization. Find your sweet spot. Aim for material where you understand 80-95%, challenging enough to grow, but not so difficult that it becomes frustrating. Prioritize enjoyment. Choose content that genuinely interests you. Engagement is not just more pleasant, it's more effective for acquisition. Volume matters. The quantity of comprehensible input is a primary driver of success. Aim for consistent daily exposure. Lower the affective filter. Create a low-stress environment. Give yourself permission to not understand everything. Focus on meaning, not perfect comprehension. Trust your brain's natural acquisition capacity. Your brain is designed to recognize patterns in language. Given sufficient input, grammar will become intuitive. The transformation can be remarkable. Learners who switch from traditional methods to comprehensible input approaches often report not just better results, but a completely different relationship with the language. From struggle to enjoyment, from work to pleasure. Here are 3 practical steps you can take today. Find one source of comprehensible input that matches both your level and interests. A podcast, YouTube channel, graded reader, or TV show with subtitles. Schedule 10, call in 15 minutes daily for the next week to engage with this content. Not studying it, but simply experiencing it with focused attention. Notice how this feels different from traditional study. Are you less stressed? More engaged? Does time pass differently? On our website, we've compiled a resource guide with comprehensible input sources for learners at every level across multiple languages. You'll find the link in the description below, and I'd love to hear from you. What has worked in your language learning journey? What comprehensible input sources have you found most valuable? Share in the comments below to help other learners discover new resources. Language learning doesn't have to be a struggle. By working with your brain's natural acquisition process, rather than against it, you can transform what might have been years of frustrating study into an enjoyable journey of discovery and connection. The secret sauce isn't a trick or shortcut. It's understanding how your brain naturally acquires language and creating the optimal conditions for that process to unfold. Thank you for joining me today. This is Harry from Comprehensible English Hub. Until next time, enjoy your language journey.